Hi everyone, I'm Gabe Gutierrez, a correspondent for NBC News. I'm based in New York, but travel all over the country and sometimes the world. For a number of years, I was based in Atlanta, and its airport provided me quick access to most breaking stories nationwide. I cover everything from natural disasters to mass shootings to criminal trials like this one. Right now, I'm here in Minneapolis, covering the murder trial of Derek Chauvin, the former officer who's charged with killing George Floyd. It's a massive story that launched a global social justice movement, and I think it's a fitting case study to look at the things reporters should be cognizant of when covering a tragedy. Of course, you need to cover it with compassion, realizing the effect your reporting has not just on the people you cover, but also on your colleagues and yourself. Let's rewind a bit to May of 2020, the morning after Memorial Day. That's when I first got an email about some strong video emerging from Minneapolis about the death of a man in police custody. I covered many stories on that beat over the past few years, so I often have a high bar for what video is truly shocking or newsworthy. But as soon as I opened this link, I knew this one was different. It was agonizing to watch that man cry out repeatedly, "I can't breathe," under the knee of a police officer. Before I'd even finished watching it, I fired off an email to Nightly News saying this video would go viral. It already was. My next step was to find out the victim's name. Again, covering these kinds of stories, I knew the network of civil rights attorneys that would likely start representing the family of the victim. That's usually how this plays out. A few hours of confusion while legal representation gets sorted out, then we start seeing images of the victims. What was his name? Well, within the hour, we finally found it. George Floyd. Well-known civil rights attorney Ben Crump was going to represent the family. It was another sign that this case would soon explode across the country and eventually the world. By then, we were also making calls to the Minneapolis Police Department and trying to line up interviews with witnesses. One of the challenges when you're assigned a major story like this and when it's breaking is tracking down some of the key players in these stories. I have several processes. First, one, reach out to the people you know in the space, the contacts you already have. Number one, civil rights attorneys, local officials that you may know from covering this area before, but also there will be witnesses who, of course, you don't know. You need to do background searches online. That can either be through NBC's Info Center or the booking unit, chances are, is already trying to make some of those calls. One of the complaints we often get from either local officials or people, average citizens who are at the center of a news story, is that they get multiple phone calls, emails, text messages from journalists at NBC News looking for essentially the same type of interview. Now, of course, that can't always be avoided, doubling up on calls, but we should try to do the best we can to streamline how many people are calling any one particular victim of trauma, especially when we're trying to secure interviews for the Today Show, for Nightly News, for MSNBC, for News Now. Sometimes these repeated interviews can really take a toll on the people that are experiencing trauma. So it's important that we try to streamline that behind the scenes as much as possible. I will reach out to the booking team to see what calls are being made, what calls do we need to make next, and what are the major players in any given story that are most important for us to put on the air. Now, when you're there, you need to start getting engrossed in the story as quickly as possible. So much happened on the George Floyd story just as soon as we got on the ground. We had to interview the owner of the convenience store where George Floyd was. I remember I did that interview as soon as we got on the ground. Later that night, there were also developments and protests, and over the next couple of days, we had to deal with riots and questions about security, where we could safely interview people. And then we also started interviewing the bystanders, the witnesses that were traumatized by what they saw. Among them that most stood out in my mind was Donald Williams. He was one of the people that watched George Floyd die under the knee of Derek Chauvin. We spoke with him a few days after the incident, and he was still obviously traumatized. It was a difficult interview.
First thing I seen was George Floyd on the ground.
And we can see the weight of the world on his shoulders. Now, something I always think about when I interview people that are dealing with trauma, this is often the worst time of their lives, the worst moments that they've ever had to deal with. And so you have to walk into those interviews with a sense of compassion and try to understand what they're going through. Now, one of the most difficult things about booking those types of interviews is that many people in those types of situations may not want to talk to you, but others will. For some of those victims, it is cathartic to tell their stories, and you really have to keep that in mind. Now, we met another person, Zoe Schaefer. Now, she always sticks in my mind because during live television, during our coverage of one of those protests outside the convenience store, she was actually speaking to us on live TV on MSNBC when she broke down in tears, and it surprised our entire crew. The emotion bubbled up, and it was this long, simmering anger that she had and frustration of what was happening in Minneapolis. It was on us, on my cameraman, Bill Angelucci, our producer, Sue Kroll, and our audio tech, Tony McGowan, to capture her story in a sympathetic and compassionate way as it played out on live television.
I won't be satisfied until I can wake up and have kids and have them not fear their lives just for being black, for being darker than other people. It's not enough. I can say it's not enough. It's not enough. It's not enough until everything changes.
I remember speaking to her. The interview went on for several minutes on live TV, and afterwards she hugged the friend she was with, and we had to capture that in a way that was not exploitative, that was not sensational, but really was honest, compassionate, and really tried to capture the essence of the story we were telling. And that's something you always have to keep in mind. It changes you, it changes the people you interview, and it changes your viewers. Now, how do you decompress? Well, for many journalists, it can be extremely difficult. The story we're on right now brings very long days. You need to try to get into somewhat of a routine. Try to take breaks as often as you can, although I need to really take my own advice on that. But even on this story, I try to keep my days off as often as I can. It's difficult when you're on a breaking story, but I try to catch up on sleep on the days off that I have. Also, it's important to talk with your colleagues, to talk with your family members, and decompress as much as you can. Now, the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, it's a project of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, which is dedicated to informed, innovative, and ethical news reporting on violence, conflict, and tragedy. And DART has some questions you should ask yourself as you're covering these stories. First, does my story portray victims of violence with accuracy, insight, and sensitivity? Is my story clear and engaging with a strong theme or focus? And does it inform readers about the ways individuals react to and cope with emotional trauma and the process of recovery? Does it avoid sensationalism, melodrama, and portrayal of victims as tragic or pathetic? And does the story emphasize the victim's experience rather than the perpetrators? I hope you learned something today. Check us out on NBCUacademy.com for more lessons on reporting and how we make the news happen. For NBCU Academy, I'm Gabe Gutierrez. Thanks for watching.